Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I'm here today at Guns.com taking a look at some of the cool guns that they have in their warehouse. And today, specifically, we're checking out an HK USC. This is the semi-auto civilian commercial version of the UMP submachine gun. So the UMP came about as an attempt to get a more economical to produce submachine gun, essentially going from the stamped MP5, but the stamped MP5 that's full of complicated bits, because it's roller delayed blowback, over to the new modern generation of polymer-bodied, simple blowback submachine guns. So this is an extremely simple gun and extremely inexpensive to manufacture. Frankly, HK would love to replace all of its military and security MP5 sales with UMP sales because they're easier to work on and they presumably have a much higher profit margin, but nobody who really gets their hands on an MP5 and a UMP ever really wants to go back to the UMP. They just want to keep the MP5. So we have seen adoption of the UMP by a number of security services worldwide, but really the more common thing is like people buy a few, try them out. A few departments will actually standardize on the UMP, but most people just want to keep their MP5s.
Today's video is generously sponsored by Guns.com. Not only do they have their own warehouse full of cool, new, and collectible stuff, like the gun that we're filming there today, but they also do purchasing. So if you have that gun lying around that maybe isn't as interesting to you as you thought it would be when you got it, or something that you've outgrown, or just something that you need to flip to make some cash for some other expenses, well, consider Guns.com. They have a program they call We Buy Guns at guns.com/we-buy-guns that makes the whole process of selling to them very simple. Just fill out an online form with a couple questions about make, model, and condition, snap a couple of photos with your phone, upload it to them, and they will get back to you lickety-split with an offer for the piece. If you like it, they send you a prepaid shipping label, drop the gun in the mail, and get your cash. You don't have to deal with online auction fees. You don't have to deal with trying to find a good local gun shop that'll consign it to a small group of local people. It's potentially an outstanding option for you. And it means that there's always some new, interesting pre-owned stuff cycling through the Guns.com warehouse for either you to get or perhaps me to film. So let's get back to today's video.
Just like HK made semi-auto versions of the MP5, in 2000 they decided to release a semi-auto version of the UMP. It's the USC, the Universal Semi-Automatic Carbine. It was chambered in 45 ACP. The secondary concept of the UMP was a primarily for the American security market submachine gun chambered in 45, something the MP5 never did. It was eventually also released in 9mm and 40 Smith & Wesson, but its hallmark kind of remains being in 45 auto, and the USCs are all 45 automatic. So, obviously it's semi-automatic only. The barrel was extended out to 16 inches so that it's not a short-barreled rifle, and then there were a number of changes that were made both to comply with US import law and also to make the gun distinctively civilianized under German auspices. So things like replacing the pistol grip with a thumbhole stock. The actual parts disassembly is a little bit different so that you cannot take a UMP lower assembly and drop it onto this and turn it into a machine gun. Had to do that. And the magazine well was changed so that it can only use single stack 10-round magazines. So you can't use standard UMP magazines, you can only use the reduced capacity USC magazines. Now, this was originally introduced in 2000. It went out of production in 2013, and those guns were gray, kind of like the early, a light gray color, kind of like the early SL8 rifles, the civilian version of the G36. Well, there was apparently enough demand for the USC that it was reintroduced as a limited production gun in 2018 and remains in on and off limited production to this day. But the current production ones are actually black, which is that's a significant daring step for HK Oberndorf to undertake, to actually make a civilian gun that is black. So they're kind of stepping outside of the box a little bit with this. Anyway, let's take a closer look. There's at least one cool mechanical feature inside that you might not have seen. And if we're going to take a look at this, we'll start with the overly long 16-inch barrel and then slide into the actual receiver section here. We have the actual receiver mark where it says USC. We then have the German manufacturer's mark. We have the American import mark. We, of course, have to have warning, refer to owner's manual stamped on there. Back up at the front, we have a metal tag embedded in the polymer. That's a legal requirement, and that's your serial number right there. Made in Germany. It's a CIP-proofed gun. And we can also note here in front of that Ulm Proofmark antler, we have a CC, and that is a letter code indicating 22. This is a 2022 production gun. We've got a classic HK style of selector here, single shot and safe, of course. Interesting that they actually serialized the plastic buttstock assembly. That's not something you typically see. We've got a rubber butt plate on the back. It's a hard rubber butt plate, so it's really much more for grip on your shoulder than it is any sort of recoil absorption. Not that there's going to be a whole lot of recoil on a pistol caliber carbine. The rear sight, you have two options. You have a big round aperture and you have an open notch sight. And then at the front, you have a trapezoidal plastic front post inside a very hefty, heavy-duty plastic protective ring. The charging handle is essentially exactly the same as the style on the MP5. So cycle the bolt and you can lock it open in the upward position to lock the bolt open. You can, in fact, give this the HK slap, although it doesn't feel quite as rewarding as an MP5, just doesn't quite have the same tone to it, but you can do it there if that's important to you. And then we got bolt hold open and bolt release. Note, if we look on the bottom here, the magazine well is pretty narrow. It uses these single stack 10 round magazines. And being polymer, you know, there were a lot of AKs were imported with single stack magazine wells, but then they could be easily milled out to use standard double stack magazines after the guns were in the US. This is one of those situations where HK as a company is primarily interested in complying as best they can, where a lot of other countries and other companies will attempt to comply in the way that will allow the guns to actually be most desirable once they get into the US. HK was not really that interested in allowing, in making it easy for people to convert these guns back to proper double stack magazines. So same thing. They did the same sort of thing with the G36, the SL8 conversions, which are definitely more difficult to convert back to G36 configuration than they need to be. There are a series of threaded plugs in the gun. There's one or a pair up on top of the receiver to allow you to attach pieces of Picatinny rail if you want to attach optics or other accessories. Disassembly, of course, HK has their famous quick detach pins that, you don't get on this. Instead, they have attached the buttstock with a pair of socket head screws. There is just a little bit of spring tension on these parts, so it kind of helps to hold this together when you're pulling out the second screw. But with that removed, I can then pull off the buttstock. We've got a little rubber buffer pad there to absorb the last impact of the bolt. The fire control group on the regular UMP comes all the way out to the end, and then you have a folding stock assembly that goes in here. On the USC, in order to make sure that parts cannot interchange with the UMP, they've essentially cut the back off of this, among other differences. That's not the only thing. But this is our fire control housing. All the fire control parts are plastic. There are few, like there's a metal insert in the face of the hammer, but this is simultaneously cheap and also kind of weirdly complicated for a fire control group. And of course, semi-auto only. Note also on the proper UMP, the pistol grip is integral to this component. They cut the pistol grip off so that they could put it on the thumbhole stock. Now we can drop the bolt out. Bonk, there's that. The recoil spring is just nested inside, so captive recoil spring, nothing to see there. Unlike the somewhat complex MP5 bolt with its delaying system and its separate bolt head, the UMP/USC bolt is extremely simple. It's all flat surfaces and mostly square corners. It is closed bolt operating, so we have a firing pin back here that gets struck by a hammer. We have a firing pin assembly that's inside there, and the rest of this is just one big chunk, essentially. Now, the most interesting element here is the out-of-battery safety, which is something that you want to have. You don't want especially in submachine guns. You don't want the firing pin to be able to protrude early and detonate a cartridge before it's fully seated in the chamber. Now, on the UMP, in a rather clever way, they actually use this, which is the ejector, to double as the out-of-battery safety. So normally what you'd get with this is you have a fixed ejector here so that when the bolt comes backward, the ejector is going to be riding in this rail right here, and you can see it protrudes into the bolt face. So when the bolt comes back and that ejector comes poking through the breech face there, it's going to kick the empty case out the ejection port. However, what this is also doing is pushing the firing pin assembly rearwards. But it only does this when the bolt's fully in battery. So if we look at the back where the firing pin is hit by the hammer, it's actually flush with the bolt, and you've got this little ledge. So if the hammer drops here, it's not actually going to hit anything. The firing pin's not going to move. However, the firing pin assembly is two pieces, and the ejector, when the bolt's fully in battery, is going to press this front section of the firing pin back. And that causes it to actually protrude out the back of the bolt, where this is such a German design here, it's rather overcomplicated. This is actually an external sleeve that the firing pin runs inside. So when it's back, the firing pin protrudes and can now be pressed in. And you'll notice I can press the firing pin in despite the fact that I'm holding the firing pin sleeve backwards. And so now, you can't see it protrude all the way forward. You can see it come close, but it's also a firing pin that's short enough that it will only protrude all the way through because it's got inertia from being whacked by the hammer. So I can actually take this out and show it to you. This cross pin holds the firing pin assembly in place, so I can just pop that out and then push that down, and we can get this whole thing out. So there you can see all the parts. This is the firing pin return spring. This is what makes sure that the firing pin's not just naturally poking out the front of the bolt. And then we've got a larger diameter, shorter spring inside that connects this bushing against the rest of the firing pin. So complicated, but practical and effective and kind of interesting. But that's about the only feature of note in here. The rest of this is just a molded polymer shell with a trunnion and barrel fitted into it. Got some sling attachment points up at the front and your sights. If one is to give a candid assessment of the handling characteristics of the USC, you're probably not going to make a whole lot of friends in HK Oberndorf. The gun is frankly awkward and clunky and badly balanced. The 16-inch barrel, and it's a heavy profile barrel, is awkwardly forward heavy. The pistol grip is weirdly squarish and overly large. It really doesn't need to be, but they just made a really uncomfortable grip for it. The trigger's not great. Magazine capacity is unfortunate. And you've got like a 3/4 pound, I think it's actually 11-ounce bolt slamming back and forth every time you fire. This is not the smooth shooting fantastic gun that the MP5 is. This is frankly a cheap to manufacture, deliberately cheap to manufacture, primarily cheap to manufacture polymer bodied PCC. It is convenient for the Germans that this was, even the UMP was a closed bolt hammer fired gun. That made it pretty easy to convert to semi-automatic for them. But compared to the other options on the market, it's really hard to come up with a justifiable use case for paying HK money, because they do charge HK money for these things. I think the current MSRP is $1,300 or $1,500 compared to the other options out there for a .45 caliber PCC. There's a lot of other stuff, and most of the other stuff is better than the USC, with one exception, and that is if you want a gun that actually looks like a proper UMP, basically a clone build. If you're going to cut the barrel off, replace the buttstock assembly with a proper folding stock, give it a proper double stack magwell, you're going to end up with a cool looking HK, and HK has cachet to it. You can actually eventually, with a little bit of infusion of money and finding the right parts, you can turn this into a much cooler version of what it really ought to have been in the first place. And I think that is the primary use case for the demand for actual USC carbines. And it's kind of impressive that there is enough demand for these to maintain them as a production item. I'm kind of surprised that they haven't dropped out of production again. But there are enough people who really want to have that proper looking HK that they continue to buy USCs so that they can convert them into the gun that HK wasn't willing to give them in the first place. Anyway, hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.